Thank you very much, Governor Linde. Let us now begin with the first session of today's conference entitled Reducing Fiscal Vulnerabilities. Allow me to introduce and welcome Miriam Fernandez de Heredia, who will chair and introduce the participants of the session. The floor is yours.
Well, I'll sit down, actually. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm really delighted to chair this first panel today. So we're going to talk about something that is very pertinent to actually even today's topic in Spain in fiscal matters. That is, so as you know, the budget discussions are starting in Parliament today. So it would be, so I think everything that we will discuss during this, like 75 minutes, will be very pertinent to what is going on also on the day-to-day so fiscal activities in the country. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by my fellow panelists. So Mr. Servas-Serros, that is a Deputy Director General in the DG for Economic and Fiscal Affairs at the European Commission. Mr. José Luis Escrivá, that is the President of the Spain Fiscal Council, the IREF, and Mrs. Emma Navarro, that is the Secretary General for the Spanish Treasury. So each one of them will tackle specific issues that pertain to the topic that we are going to address today. So lowering Spain fiscal vulnerabilities. So Mr. De Rose will talk and will try to answer questions such as, for instance, so what are the main fiscal vulnerabilities and challenges for Spain? So how can we tackle those issues? So are there any reform or fiscal reform or policy options that will help Spain to comply with the fiscal consolidation framework? Mr. Escrivá will tackle things related to the role of fiscal governance, So what are the main, in his initial remarks, he will cover things like, for instance, the main challenges for Spain's fiscal framework. So how could structural reforms help improve fiscal compliance and strengthen governance? So what are the reforms that we need in a decentralized country such as Spain, for instance? Finally, Mrs. Navarro will tackle things pertaining to fiscal strategy in a post-crisis area in Spain. So what would be the appropriate adjustment pace to tackle the high level of public debt that Spain currently has to withhold? So what are the policy options for a growth-friendly fiscal framework? So what is Spain's position regarding the debate on fiscal issues currently at the European level? So we will give you insights, the panelists will give you insights, we will try to answer these questions. And so let me spend just 1 minute going through how the logistics of this panel will work. So each one of the panelists will go through the topics that I have just referred to. So after that, what I would like to do is to embark upon a discussion among us on what has been said so far. And then what I will do in the end is that I will open the floor for questions. So bear with us, so jot down what you hear, what you will be interested in asking to the panelists, because there will be time at the end to answer all these questions. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Mr.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to both the Banco de España and IMF for the kind invitation. Before going into the issue of the first session, let me first reiterate what the Governor has indicated, namely that economic news from Spain is encouraging. The economy is now in its fifth year of expansion, and real GDP has surpassed its 2008 pre-crisis peak last year. Growth is also more balanced than before the crisis, and employment is very strong. I would just like to emphasize here that the Spanish authorities deserve considerable credit for this remarkable performance. Since 2012, indeed, a wave of sweeping structural reforms combined with steadfast implementation of measures to restore financial stability has laid the foundations for the impressive turnaround. But while the unwinding of macroeconomic imbalances is ongoing, high debt levels, both public, private and external, as well as high unemployment, still represent important vulnerabilities. And on the way to resilience, Spain will have to tackle these vulnerabilities, and especially in the public finances side. In my presentation today, I would like to focus on 4 policy challenges: avoiding pro-cyclicality, rebuilding fiscal buffers, safeguarding fiscal sustainability, and if I have time to go a little bit into the 4th one, improving the coordination between government levels. Let me move to the first part, and pro-cyclical fiscal stance. After peaking at around 11% of GDP in 2009, the government deficit has been on a steady, albeit gradual downward path since 2012. Initially, and in the midst of the crisis, significant fiscal tightening has led to a cut in budget deficits. Since 2015, deficit reduction has been largely driven by economic recovery and favorable financial conditions, as indicated on the left-hand side. In fact, over the period 2015 and 17, the fiscal stance was expansionary against the background of a rapidly narrowing output gap. As shown in the right-hand panel, the structural balance in primary terms deteriorated by some 2.5 percentage points in those 2 years, against the background of a narrowing of the output gap by close to 7 percentage points. As a result, Spain is still in excessive deficit, despite well-grounded expectations that it would exit the process in 2017, 1 year ahead of schedule. Hence, the debt ratio has plateaued at a high level, at close to 100% of GDP. This tendency towards pro-cyclicality is unfortunately not new, and I would say also not reserved only for the Spanish case. But failing to use the good times to strengthen public finances only increases the fiscal consolidation efforts required during the crisis, as has been clearly seen during the period 2012-13, when Spain adopted measures close to 2.5% on an annual basis. The second vulnerability I want to highlight is the absence of fiscal buffers. As a legacy of the crisis, Spain's public debt leaves the economy and public finances vulnerable to shocks. So what should be the size of the fiscal buffer? There are different matrices, and in the left-hand panel I just indicated 2 most used indicators in the Commission. In blue, the distance to Spain's medium-term budgetary objective. This is set as a structural balance in structural terms. With its structural deficit projected at 3.1% of GDP in 2018, Spain is currently, as already indicated by the Governor, the member state which is furthest away from its MTO. In yellow, you can see the medium-term fiscal sustainability indicator, so-called S1, which measures the cumulative structural adjustment in primary terms needed over the 5 years in order to bring the debt ratio to 60% threshold within 15 years. The picture for Spain is that once that it has achieved MTO, so has done 3% of adjustment, it will still have to go an extra mile of around 2 percentage points in order to reduce the medium-term fiscal sustainability risk that Spain is facing. Another question is, what is the adequate pace for rebuilding fiscal buffers? Here, in the right-hand panel, I indicated a number of scenarios. The first one, which is the blue line, is based on unchanged policies. It draws on our Commission's forecast until 2019, and then it uses the assumption of constant primary balances thereafter. The second and third scenarios, the green and the grey lines, are based on the so-called matrix requirement of the HGP, preventive arm. In normal economic times, a member state with a debt ratio above 60% is required to make an annual effort of 0.6%, which is the green line. At this rate, Spain would reach its MTO in 2022. But in good economic times, which is the current outlook for Spain for 2019 and beyond, the annual effort should be higher, namely at 1% of GDP. Adhering to this adjustment path from 2019 onwards would allow reaching the MTO already in 2021. The final scenario, which is the red line, corresponds to Spain's own fiscal rule, which demands that the MTO be reached in 2020. Distributing the effort evenly over the 3 years, 2018 to 20, would also imply an annual adjustment of 1% of GDP. To conclude, the first scenario, the blue line, is certainly not compatible with rebuilding buffers, while the remaining 3 scenarios present more viable options, but with different degrees of ambition. So it would be interesting to hear from Emma which scenario that she would put forward in the medium-term program. The next question is, in which areas should further consolidations gains be sought? In my view, it is not so much on the expenditure side of the budget that should bear the brunt of the adjustment. There has been expenditure restraint in recent years, and the public spending ratio in Spain is relatively low. That said, I would certainly welcome ongoing spending review and the potential for further efficiency gain that it explores. Here, I would also look forward to see what José Luis has to say, as he is in charge of the spending review in Spain. For me and for the Commission, it's on the revenue side that I see the largest scope for consolidation measures. As you can see on the left, Spain has been the lowest tax to GDP ratio among the member states, but also face high sustainability risk. Let me just focus on 2 potential types of taxes: VAT and external environmental taxes. Reducing the VAT policy gap would be a particularly promising avenue. This policy gap in Spain is one of the largest in the EU. Spain operates a standard VAT rate which is very close to the EU, but has significant recourse to reduced, super-reduced, and exemptions. Eliminating the reduced and super-reduced rates would yield about 1.5% of GDP, which is indicated in the graph. Perhaps too ambitious and more realistic would be scaling back the scope of the reduced rates to the EU average, which would increase revenues by 0.8% of GDP, which is the yellow on the right-hand side. Despite increases in recent years, Spain also has lower environmental taxes as a share of GDP compared to the EU average. Bringing the environmental taxes to the EU average would lead to an increase of revenues of 0.5% of GDP, and the more ambitious approach would be to bring the environmental tax in Spain to those of the member states with the highest tax take on environmental taxes, which would yield an additional 2% of GDP. Let me move to the third vulnerability, namely sustainability of public finances. The left panel shows the quite known debt projections over the next 10 years. In the baseline, which is the blue one, debt is expected to come down only slightly and to hover around 95% of GDP. By contrast, a scenario of compliance with the GDP, which is the yellow one, brings about a steady decline to about 75% of GDP over 10 years. This would require sustaining an average structural primary balance of 2.5% of GDP over the next 10 years, compared to -0.5% at current. I would call this an ambitious but feasible scenario. These debt trajectories are quite sensitive to shocks, and as normal in these circumstances, we also have a number of adverse shocks to growth, interest rates, which indicate that then the debt would, of course, increase further, and combined interest and growth shocks, even small ones, will bring debt back to 110% of GDP. And there are other shocks like contingent liabilities, which could further increase debt over the medium term. As in most member states, Spain will be confronted with a rapidly aging population in the coming decades. That will push up the dependency ratio and lead to upward pressure on age-related spending such as pensions and care. As you can see on the left-hand side, pension expenditure does not seem to pose a challenge in Spain in the long term in 2070. Indeed, by 2070, the expenditure ratio is actually projected to be 1.5% lower than it is today. This essentially reflects the significance of the 2011 and 2013 pension reforms, whose impact is estimated at 4% of GDP in the longer term. But there are a number of caveats to this more benign picture. Let me just indicate three. First, the spending profile over time is much more hump-shaped than for the average euro area, as you can see on the graph. Pension expenditure is expected to first rise, and significantly so over the next 2 decades, as the baby boom generation starts to retire, and spending expenditure would peak at 14.5% by 2045. This is more than 2 percentage points higher than today, which certainly poses a challenge for policymakers. Second, what I have just highlighted comes out of our base scenario. We have also simulated alternative scenarios, and adverse shocks either to productivity growth or to fertility rates would increase even further, which is the dotted red lines, the pension expenditure over the next 2 decades. And last but not least, these projections are based on the no policy change assumption. As I indicated, Spain undertook major reforms in 2011 and 2013, and these projections assume full implementation of these reforms. And these reforms, in principle, ensure sustainability almost by design, because they adapt benefit ratios to benefit levels upon retirement to life expectancy. As is shown in the middle panel, Spain's pensions benefit ratio and replacement ratio are both projected to fall significantly, but on average to remain higher than in the EU, also in the longer term. Still, this large decline in the adequacy in the benefit ratios and representation level raises concerns about the adequacy of these pensions reforms, at least for certain groups, especially those most affected by the labour market crisis of recent years, as they may not have been able to build sufficient pension rights. I gather from the policy debate in Spain that there are also features of the reformed pension system are increasingly being questioned, which is also related to the large protected deficit in the social security sector, which is also prompting a debate on reforms. From what I have just told, it is important that any future reforms reverse the hard on sustainability in Spain. Just the last word on the right-hand panel, where you can see the age costs related to long-term care, and here you can see that over the next decades, these costs will triple from 0.7% to 2.25% over the long haul, with even risks which are even much higher than on the pension reforms. So but the message here is that while the pension reform and the debate is ongoing, in the case of long-term care and care, there is quite some pressure on spending over the long haul. Let me finish with my fourth vulnerability, which is the cooperation between the different levels of government. The next speaker will say more about the fiscal framework in Spain and about the regional financing system. So I here will focus just on one particular aspect, which is the fiscal rules and the compliance with fiscal rules at the regional level in Spain. As you can see from the left-hand panel, the degree of compliance with fiscal rules at the regional level is quite varied and has been quite low in quite a number of years, like in 2014-15. Also, in 2016 and 16, compliance with the deficit targets improved, but did not really help to comply with expenditure rules, which is one of the major difficulties for the Spanish fiscal rules, which is the inconsistency between deficit rules and expenditure rules. In view of improving the fiscal framework in Spain, and certainly the fiscal rules in Spain, there is a need and scope for increasing the incentives to meet the different fiscal targets. And on the right-hand side, you see the three most important avenues to be followed. One is improving target setting by setting more ambitious, realistic, but also internal consistent targets. And the question mark here is to what extent is there scope or need for differentiated targets at a regional level. The second challenge is to enforce the targets, and here there's particularly a need for more automaticity of the enforcement of the fiscal rules in Spain. And lastly, very specifically, there is a possibility to strengthen the expenditure rule in Spain, which is less robust than, for instance, the expenditure rule at European level, And so going in European level or the European direction in the case of expenditure rules would certainly help better compliance with expenditure rules in Spain. Let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Rose. I have just jotted down a few things that I'll ask you later to comment on whether you would like to add something in terms of challenges. So no pro-cyclicality, try to avoid it. So rebuild fiscal buffers so that we are not always like on the edge. Acting on the revenue side as opposed to the expenditure side more. So I'll be curious to know your thoughts about it, because I'm always more like expenditure control freak than revenue growth. So safeguard fiscal sustainability, so that's I guess is essential. Addressing fiscal challenge of aging and improve coordination across levels of governments. So we'll come back to some of these issues later. So Mr. Escrivá, so the floor is yours now on fiscal governance, please.
Okay, first of all, I would like to join Servas in thanking the IMF and the Banco de España for this kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be in the institution I grew up as an economist. In assessing the topic of this debate, I think it's useful to take first some perspective. And here in this chart you have first the primary expenditure in Spain over basically the last 20 years, and now here is the revenue, both related to the GDP. So the gap between the two is the primary balance. I chose 1999 deliberately because there is broad consensus that by the turn of the century, Spain was in a cyclical position. And probably now, Servas might say, or the Commission may say that already closed the upward gap, the OECD may say that in 2020, okay, we believe that by the end of this year, early next year, we may be again in a cyclical position. So we have two points, 1999, 2018, where we can compare fiscal figures, basically removing cyclical influences. And I think that interestingly, in 1999 we have a primary, around the turn of the century, we have a primary balance of 2 percentage points of GDP. Now we have basically null. We are in a basically equilibrium in terms of primary balance. When we examine further what is behind, we can detect a number of interesting findings. First, now expenditure is significantly above the levels in 1999. There is 2.5% above in terms of social security, primarily pensions, relative to the situation in 1999. And another additional 1 percentage point is related to social expenditure, health, etc., education. This is only partially offset by the significant decline in fixed capital formation of 1.5. So overall, we are around 2.5% above the level that we have in the private cycle. And I think also what we examine what is behind, I think everyone would concur that basically the new levels of expenditure on social and pension is primarily to be here forever, it's structural, while the decline in fixed capital formation, when we take some benchmark, might not be the case. When we examine on the revenue side, basically we are at the same level, 38% of GDP of what we had 20 years ago, but with a change in the composition now, taxes, both direct and indirect, are 1% above, and this is compensated a structural decline in EU funds and also the seigniorage coming from this house. If we examine further, we can see that the sectoral disequilibrium behind is primarily this 2%, what we have is a significant primary deficit of the social security, which is offset by surplus in the subnational sector and in the state. Again, I think we can look at the same issue looking at the debt. Interestingly, in 1999, the debt level was 60% of GDP. Then we have this decline absolutely swayed by cyclical factors until 2007, 2008, and then we have this huge increase in debt until recently, until 2014, and we reached the 100%. When we examined what is behind, and here there's a breakdown, we have estimated, in addition to the various factors which are related to the crisis in a way or another, you have also a significant component which is structural, around 20% percentage points could be attributed to this, to structural factors, so that in a way these structural factors were concealed behind the boom in the first part of the last decade and emerge afterwards. In a way, you can, if you want to think in terms of a structural debt level of that kind, this 20% factor could bring the structural debt level by 2014, or even now, because since then things have not changed too much, around 80% of GDP. This could be a certain level. Again, we can look at this figure or projection from another perspective, just a traditional projection of debt. If we project it with what we think is the current structural primary balance, with all what we know now, which is this primary balance in equilibrium, debt level would convert. It's another way to look at the same issue, the same finding that in the previous slide. We would convert to around 80% again in 15 years, asymptotically to that level. Of course, if we were to comply with the rules and we want to move to MTO and stay there for a number of years, in 15 years we would even cross the 60% and we would be below that level. I think it's 50 something, this 56, 57 in this projection. So the problem is, and I think that's the issue at the stake, is that this is rather unprecedented in Spain. Here I have taken, this is a series we have produced in IMF from actually mid-19th century, but if we focus actually in the primary balance in Spain over the last 40 years, since we have democracy, you will see that the average primary balance is minus 1.2, and it's very rare, except in the booming days, to be exceeding the level of 2%. In a way, this is telling us that the effort we have to make in the years to come in order to move consistently to 60 is unprecedented. We haven't managed in Spain in the past to do so. It's also true that we never had the current levels of debt, which are really pushing you to move in that direction. But in a way, we are moving to, we have to see something for which we don't have track record. And I think, and in this I concur very much with Servas, this should be the priority. We need to make further efforts to bring debt levels down, taking advantage of the good times now, and create fiscal buffers. And 80%, which is, or 80 something, or around that field, which is we think would emerge if we do nothing, or we would unchanged policy basically, is not a comfortable level. It's not for two reasons. First, because what we have learned from the crisis is that in a monetary union, without the exchange rate adjustment mechanism, with a monetary policy that cannot be very suitable to you, with the transmission mechanism of monetary policy broken down, as we experience here, fiscal policy will be overburdened. So in a monetary union, debt levels should be lower than otherwise. And I think that this is one of the major lessons from the crisis. But in addition, I think we have significant risk looming. Servas referred to, I will present it in a different way, more qualitatively, I would say. First, we have the traditional contingent liabilities stemming from state-owned enterprises, PPPs. Here, there is debt which is not accounted for now, that will emerge very likely in the years to come, although the size now after is of I would say, of relative limited importance. I mean, at most 3.5% of GDP, but okay, this will count and will count. Aging related, I mean, we have also our own estimates are not so different from those of the Commission, although maybe we may think that probably in pensions, probably we have lower figures, but probably higher in others, in social care and health. But overall, between 2 and 4 percentage points of GDP could be a range in which you can move over the medium to long term, and this is almost certain. Financial crisis will come back. I mean, will come back. I mean, on average, every 15 years, we have a crisis in Spain. And I think that the effects will become probably are becoming larger because of two reasons. First, because in the past, we have the possibility to rely on monetary financing, and part of the crisis remained in the balance sheet of the central bank, and that's what the old crisis were managed in a way, and in a way you solve it with some inflation. This is not any longer the environment we are, and in addition, the financial sector is growing. So financial crisis will come back, and we will see continued liabilities and continuous are there. And finally, something nobody talks, and probably we should not, but there are geopolitical risks. We are in a monetary union which is still fragile. We were close to a very difficult situation a few years ago. Here, the impacts could be huge, and we need to be prepared for even this kind of event. So for all these reasons, I think we have to move very decisively to much lower levels of debt of those which will emerge from current policies. And I think that the way out to tackle this is strengthening further the fiscal framework in Spain in different directions. Significant progress, we have to acknowledge, has been made. On transparency, now Spain is probably a first-class country in terms of frequency, detail of fiscal data, breakdown, etc. But still, there is room for improvement. In particular, although we have a lot of information, a lot of data, we know not what we should know about how data are produced, methodologies, accounting criteria of national accounts. The information is scarce. The IMF has made many recommendations to the relevant authorities here to improve, and we see very limited progress. And all the more, the institution that should provide transparency and clarity here, which is the Technical Committee of National Accounts, that is mandated to be created 4 years ago from organic law, has not been established, and we don't know why. But the second framework, which I think is even more relevant, of course, is the normative framework and the institutional framework in general terms. Here we have also made significant progress. Starting out with the Article 135 of the Constitution, we have an organic law. We have further laws that deals with, for example, commercial debt and payments. We have a transparency law, which also has bring about significant changes in the way in which control auditors are undertaken. So a lot of things has been done, but a lot of things remains to be done, and there is room for improvement. And I will finish my presentation by focusing here on two issues, which is weak enforcement and design deficiencies. On weak enforcement, I will identify two issues here. First is that the fiscal rules remain problematic. I mean, the way the numeric figures are set lack on occasions background in order to make it realistic but also medium-term oriented. The hierarchy of rules is not well established in the law. There is a loose framework. While there is a stronger framework from the subnationals, there is a loose framework for enforcement in the case of the central government. There is still a lot of areas of discretion that are exploited here and there, so we need to more automatic mechanisms. And I think that is very important. A key institution, which is the Council for Fiscal and Financial Policy, where the government and myself actually and the Minister of Finance of the regions gather that there are governance problems, which results primarily of a lack of ownership of the entire administration as regards the fiscal rules and the fiscal framework. I mean, the second area here on behind weak enforcement has to do basically with mismatches across sectors in financing. I mean, it's extremely problematic, the fact that the municipality sector has a structural surplus about 0.5% of the Spanish GDP, and this remains that the pressures for this sector to spend it in a way or another, probably in the most productive way, are mounting. And this has to do with the mismatch of competencies. At the same time, we have the social security in an extremely weak situation, or if we examine the situation across regions, there are regions which are certainly underfinanced and others are overfinanced. This again creates the same problems, and from the fiscal sustainability point of view, creates something that I have seen very much, which is basically when you have institutions which are underfinanced, you lack moral authority to enforce compliance. And this is happening in Spain and will continue happening until we solve these problems once and for all. So these, with a weak fiscal ownership, are behind the problems we have examined and we have observed over the last few years. And in a way, and this is not very different actually from, in some respect, what happens at the European level with the countries, what ultimately worked was the conditionality associated to the extraordinary mechanisms, liquidity mechanisms. This was actually the true driver of fiscal discipline, and this is problematic. This is problematic, but this is transitory, and there is far more discretion here that with the stability law, and in addition, I would say that there is lack of transparency in some respects in how this conditionality is implemented. So let's move to design weaknesses, and here I would identify also two main problems. One is the lack of a medium-term approach. The medium-term approach in Spain is primarily boils down basically to the stability program. But the stability program is very much a pro forma instrument. It's very much linked to the budgetary process of the various administration. Moving targets are constant here. So in a way, we lack an anchor, a medium-term anchor, that could give, in a way, predictability about the way we are going to achieve a certain path towards fiscal consolidation. And this is certainly a problem that has to do with, and here there are some points in this slide about what is behind. And the second has to do with basically the design of the rules. I'm going to finish that now. With the design of the rules, there are also quite a number of problems. I mean, you have there listed some of them. I would say that servers remain to the expenditure benchmark or the expenditure rule. I mean, certainly we need to come up with something far more elaborated there, and I would say sophisticated and probably refined. But the overall problem, in a way, is the following, in my view, is that there is the conception, I mean, the view that the rules are designed basically to ex post check the compliance. And there is very much people involved in this business that thinks that way. So it's ex post checking if someone has complied or not. And we are in a way forgetting, which is truly the key thing, which is preemptive. The rule system and the framework should be designed in order to be preemptive, to anticipate, to help institutions to program their fiscal needs and to try to adhere to the rules. And ultimately, if this fails, then we will come the lack of compliance and the enforcement. But this is, to me, a major weakness. So in a way, and we have made some recommendations in the past in this respect, after 6 years of the stability law, it's time to rethink quite a number of issues here. Some of them to get closer to the European framework that has advanced in the meantime. But there are many elements to be rethought. We have made a recommendation, and I think it's a key opportunity to do so is the Commission initiative for the integration of the fiscal compact in the EU law. This is an initiative for 6th of December. I think that a country like Spain very much supports this, in particular because it will give Spain the opportunity and the European framework to readdress these fiscal deficiencies in the framework that I have managed and that things would be very important in order to bring about a sustainable path for fiscal finances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, José Luis. So just to summarize some of the ideas that we have just heard. So basically, what I have jotted down is that so current debt levels in Spain are not sustainable. So we need some fiscal buffers here in this country, and for that we need to strengthen the fiscal framework, and particularly so the normative one. So we need to strengthen transparency and to address some of the weaknesses that we see in the design of the current fiscal framework, so not only at the central government, but also at the central government level. So we will again discuss these issues so later on during our panel. And now I will hand it over to Mrs. Navarro, who will talk about the post-crisis fiscal strategy. Over to you.
That in a way repeat some of the slides that have been presented already, so I will go very fast. And I would say that we all agree that debt is very high, that this is having a that we have in Spain, and that we are not.
Igual después le...
Nice. Okay. So, so please let us know whether you can hear well. Right?
Now it's better? Okay.
So
I was saying that debt is very high, and this is a challenge that we have in Spain, and I think that we all agree on that. I would say that the good news is that debt is already on a downward trend. It reached the peak in 2014 and has been reducing since. And I would say that there are three factors that will help Spain to reduce the debt. The first is the improvement in the primary balance. The primary balance deteriorated very sharply in the crisis. In the worst years, it reached around 8%, 7-8% of GDP, and it has been reduced since last year. It closed at 0.5%. So this is a significant reduction, and a surplus is expected for this year. Of course, a prudent fiscal policy will be needed in the years to come. And here, compliance with the rules and the EU targets will be fundamental. And Spain, as you know, complied with last year's target, 3.1% of GDP, and there is a commitment to continue doing so in the future. The second factor is the good trend in nominal GDP growth. Here, the important thing is not only real GDP, but also inflation. And real GDP has been performing very well in the last years. We have been growing above 3% of GDP, and also this is a healthy growth. Imbalances have been addressed and reduced in the past years thanks to structural reforms, as has been said. And inflation is also in an upward trend after having faced deflationary pressures in the last year, which were negative for debt reduction. But now, inflation is hovering around 1.2, 1.4%, and it will go up to a moderate but higher levels. And here I would say that growth is expected to remain solid in the years to come, and this also will be need to be helpful, and this will need to be protected in order to favor the debt reduction. And the third point is the moderate interest burden. And here, the debt burden today is around 2.6% of GDP, which is very moderate. Of course, this has to do with monetary policy normalization, monetary policy accommodation, but also with improved confidence in the Spanish economy, which has been reflected in the reduction of the risk premium, in rating upgrades, and the high demand for our securities. Of course, interest rates will not remain low forever, and they are expected to rise, although gradually, according to market expectations. And in the Treasury, we have been preparing to face this challenge, extending the average maturity of our debt. In fact, the average maturity now is at a record high, at 7.5 years. It has substantially increased in the past years, and this is helping us to keep on reducing the average cost of debt. The average cost of outstanding debt is today at 2.5%, which is a record low, and even if interest rates increase, if increases are moderate and smooth, this will help us to keep the interest burden in a moderate level, at a similar level as today for some years. Well, in conclusion, I would say that of course, debt reduction is a challenge. Although it is not the only thing that we need to look at. We need to remember that Spain entered the global financial crisis with a fiscal situation that was completely different. We had no fiscal imbalance. At that point, we had a 2% GDP surplus, and we had a debt at 35% of GDP, which was around 30 percentage points lower than the EU average. But the problem was that we had, we were accumulating imbalances in other parts of the economy, and this translated to structural fiscal imbalances, and also there were fiscal contingent liabilities that arose during the crisis. But I think that it is important that measures have been taken both at the EU level and at the Spanish level to improve the fiscal framework, and this is helping this has helped Spain to reduce to improve the fiscal discipline. I will focus also on what is needed to ensure that how to design the debt consolidation strategy. And here, as it has been highlighted, debt needs to, the fiscal strategy needs to be credible. And for this, we need to take into account both the impact on, I will. We need to take into account not only the impact in short and long-term growth, but also other policy objectives, such as job creation, which is an important objective in Spain, or inclusive growth. I would say that we need to focus on three main issues when designing the fiscal consolidation strategy. The first is the path of the adjustment. The path needs to be gradual. A consolidation strategy that stifles growth will be unsuccessful. The second is the timing, and here I have to say that of course, fiscal multipliers are higher in recession times, so the good time to make a consolidation is the good times. The phase of the cycle is important, and good times are the best timing to reduce, to make a fiscal consolidation. But also other considerations could be important. For example, in the case of Spain, what we had to do is that we had to front-load the fiscal consolidation because we faced an important financial stability restraints. What we saw is that in our case, we needed to restore fiscal credibility, and for that reason, what we needed was to front-load the effort. And the effort that we undertook was very significant. In fact, according to the Commission and Spanish estimations, calculations, we had a fiscal structural effort of more than 3.4% of GDP, and the fiscal consolidation was undertaken in a phase that was very, I would say, recessionary, and that was needed to restore fiscal credibility and because financial considerations. And I would say that also, of course, composition of the adjustment is important. And here, as Servas and José Luis have said, the instruments chosen are very important. In fact, in the case of Spain, the IREF is undertaken expenditure review focus on subsidies, and this is very important, and this could raise savings in the future. And I would say that, of course, I think that in the case of Spain, it is very, very important that the reform of the public administration that it is undertaken, the reform of the public administration undertaken under the Cora initiative, for example, I would say that this was also important. And finally, if you excuse me, I will drink a little because, sorry for the interruption, but I think I am feeling a little dizzy. But if you, no, I think I will be fine in a minute, but I think that I just need
I think it's better if you sit down. Yeah, okay. I think it would be better.
no. No, I am, well.
Sit down, it would be better. No worries. Okay. Just stay there, stay there. Just stay there, don't faint. That's okay. That's okay.
we undertook in the past different methods to increase the efficiency of the system. On the revenue side, for example, one of the things that we mentioned is the expenditure per view that was mandated to IMF, that we focus on costing, but it also different reforms on the public administration under the so-called Coral initiative to streamline public expenditure. One of the critical methods and one of the things that we have been, one of the reasons is that we need to protect public investment. And this is important. And this is that in Spain, public expenditure was very much reduced in the crisis, although we see that the fall down also affected public infrastructure. And here, the budget for 2008 Sorry. Well, public expenditure in the 2018 budget will increase by 16%. And we also undertook measures on the revenue side. For example, taxation has been shifted towards indirect taxation. VAT rose during the crisis, and also the tax burden on employment was also reduced, and also for SMEs. And finally, a lot of efforts were stepped up to combat tax fraud. And finally, I would like to finish explaining what is the Spanish position regarding the debate on fiscal issues that is currently taking place in Europe. I think this is also an important topic because Spain is not isolated, and much of our rules and our fiscal framework and our fiscal conditions are conditioned by Europe. And the fiscal debate is part of a broader debate on completing the economic and monetary union. And Spain is one of the countries that has been pushing for having this debate on the table. Of course, this debate is not as advanced as the one on banking union or on reinforcing the ESM, but Spain believes that we need to push forward further fiscal integration in Europe, and that on the long run, the banking union needs to be matched by a fiscal union if we want the Europe area to work properly. And one of those debates is based on a central fiscal capacity, and Spain thinks that this is an important gap today on the current architecture of EMU. And a current fiscal capacity will help us to address two main drawbacks that the system has. The first is over-reliance upon monetary policy, as we have seen, and so a central fiscal capacity will help us to have a better policy mix. And the other, and this was also mentioned by previous speakers, is that national policies are overburdened and can be overburdened, especially in the event of a large shock. And for this reason, if a central fiscal capacity could be helpful. We need to take very in mind that a central fiscal capacity is not the same as having not fiscal discipline at the national level. On the contrary, to have this central fiscal capacity, compliance with the rules, the EU rules, the fiscal rules will be needed, and strict enforcement, and also other mechanisms to avoid moral hazard. For example, one important thing would be to avoid permanent transfers in this capacity. I think that the IMF has just launched a special proposal on this front to have a rainy day fund, and we believe that this is a very useful proposal, and IMF advice is also very important on these topics. And I think that there are, of course, other instruments, but this could be one of the possible instruments that could be discussed in Europe. The Commission is also going to present a proposal soon. And also the other part of the debate that we are having in Europe, although it is less advanced, but what has been mentioned already, is the debate on reforming the fiscal rules. And here, what we need is the rules have become very complex now, and what it is needed is flexible, credible fiscal rules that are easy to communicate. And the problem that the current system has is that it is based on indicators to assess the fiscal stance that are not observable and are subject to revisions and not under the control of the government. And as it has been mentioned, there are differences on the timing of the closure of output gap between different institutions. So I think that this is not to say that this is not to defend a pro-cyclical fiscal policy, but we need to be cautious when drawing at the conclusions on indicators that are not observable and have inconsistencies. And in Europe, we are working to improve those methodologies, and this is one important thing. And as it has been said, it would be important, for example, to simplify the rules and have a debt anchor and expenditure rule, as has been proposed by some economists. That could be a way forward. Well, I want to conclude just emphasizing that debt is a challenge, and that we need not to be complacent, and we need to address this challenge and be aware, and awareness of the society is very important in this regard. But fiscal discipline alone is not the solution. We need more things. We need to have the fiscal balances in order, but also the rest of the house in order, and keep on improving the economy and having healthy growth, and based on more balanced growth and structural reforms would be a key issue for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, super. Excellent. So thank you very much. We don't have much time, but I would like to engage in a bit of a debate. So actually, I have a question for the panel. I have only one, and then you can answer it in many different ways. So it's broad enough. And then for like 2 or 3 minutes, I would like to open the floor for questions if you have any. So my question to the panel is the following. So how, based on everything that we have heard today, based on your own experience, so how well prepared do you think Spain is for the next downturn? Because the next downturn will arrive. So I'm not saying it will be next year. It might be next year. It might be in 5 years from now. But it will. But the economy works in cycles, and there will be a downturn. So how well prepared is Spain now, or how well prepared do we expect, in your view, we will be when this comes? We'll start with you, Sebas.
Okay, thank you. It's quite a vast and difficult question to answer in a few minutes. How well prepared is Spain? From my presentation, you could certainly identify that I have doubts to the extent to which Spain is prepared, and to the extent to which there are sufficient buffers for the next downturn, whenever it comes. It will come, when, we don't know. So I would certainly be much more at ease if Spain would succeed over the medium term to reach at least its medium term target. So quite an adjustment to be undertaken. Another issue that I would think that is quite important in the case of Spain, but it's a wider issue and that will be discussed later on. And here I take a little bit of issue for the debate with José Luis, saying that fiscal discipline is key for debt sustainability, which is true. I indicated as well that the primary surplus of around 2.25% would be reserved over the next 15 years almost, in order to attaining it and preserving it, in order to get your debt down to more reasonable levels. You say that's not the norm, and you seem to question that. Although I have seen that, as your slide indicated, it was the norm achieved in '99. And if I remember well, studies from the Bank of Spain during the so-called good period, 95, 2007, the primary surplus was in the order of 1.75% of GDP. So it's a little bit higher, but the situation is also much worse than it was at the time. So I do think that it's ambitious. I fully agree with that, but it's certainly doable. It's also doable and necessary if you look into the literature, the recent literature, which indicates that countries with very high debt, and I know, so there I take issue a little bit with the slide, that normally sustained primary surpluses of more than 1 or 2% are very rare, which is true, but we have seen that in those countries with high public debt, there are more than one example that at least primary surpluses of 2% can be maintained over the long haul. So I do think that it's, and Spain is not there, so there is an adjustment needed for 3%. But fiscal discipline is not the only issue. That's a point I would like to make. Bringing your debt down, fiscal discipline is a key ingredient, but you also have to work on your growth side, on the supply side. And so, because underlying all our projections, and I guess also one of José Luis, we have potential growth of around 1.5% over the long haul, over the next 1 or 2 decades, which is quite different from what we had in the past. And if you want to replicate what we did in the past, so the whole growth agenda to stimulate your potential growth and actual growth to the order of 2% or 3% over the long haul will certainly help much more. But there, Spain is also not yet there. So structural reforms, and this will be discussed later on, many of them have been undertaken on the labor market in 2012-13, but much further elements have to be undertaken, and also productivity, those facts productivity is much too low over the long haul in order to bring your debt down. So on this area, so it's a broad answer to a broad question, but on the fiscal side, a lot of things have to be done, but also on the growth side, if you want to be well prepared for the next downturn. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So José Luis, do you have a view?
Well, first of all, I'm going to say something about expenditure, because Sebas asked for that. Yeah, we are undertaking, it's true, an expenditure review, focusing this year first on subsidies and the next 2 years on other areas. I think that in a way the good news is that there is a lot of room for assessing and evaluating expenditure that has not been undertaken in Spain so far. So I think that the potential to identify areas in which expenditure can be undertaken in a more efficient way is substantial. I mean, this is our impression. We are starting with the exercise. And I would like to think that the aim should be to have more flexibility in reallocating resources from one sector and put an end to inertia in expenditure that we see here and there. I think that this is very important, and if this exercise thrives and consolidates, I wouldn't put figures because this is risky and too premature, but I think that if this exercise thrives in a regular way of assessing expenditure in all administration, it's going to be positive in a way or another in reallocating resources and probably manage the expenditure pressure stemming, for instance, from health and pensions in a way or another. To me, in order to have a more robust system for a potential downturn sooner or later, I already mentioned many structural reforms that need to be undertaken on the fiscal, on the real economy. I agree there are also a lot of room, and actually we could infer from the relatively good performance of the Spanish economy and flexibility, a balanced growth that we are enjoying now, that some reforms that were undertaken primarily after 2012-2013 are really paying off even more than we expected. So this is what I would take from what is going on. I think that just to conclude, to me there are a number of issues. I'm reluctant to talk about taxes or expenditure because in the IMF we have taken the view that I think is to try to be not normative. This is the decisions about how to consolidate is more on the democratic side, and we have to keep this aside from this discussion. That said, I would say that what seems to me more achievable in the years to come in order to have to make progress on the consolidation path is focusing first on change of competencies and trying to have a solution to the surplus of the municipalities. These municipalities have a very substantial surplus, is at risk, this surplus, and I think the only way out, in my view, is to try to shift some competencies to municipalities, primarily in the area of public services, social care and dependence, which in most countries is undertaken by and there is also overlapping between, this is very specific, but it's relevant and it's accessible. There is overlapping in the way these services are undertaken between the municipalities and the regions. So here I would focus on that, and I think this is achievable and it would be part, in a broader sense, of the reform to the financial system to the regions. That to me is also key that this is undertaken, also for sustainability perspectives. And on social security, I think that what we have seen is that the parametric reforms of 2011 are actually having even a larger effect than originally thought, and this is helpful and would help in the years to come when they are become more relevant over time. But there are a number of further parametric changes of the different kind that were not undertaken and are on the pipeline in 2011. These parametric changes, if introduced, would have a significant effect again in keeping at check the pension expenditure growth. These are things that to me are probably more achievable than others that are put forward, and I think that should help moving in the direction you mentioned.
Excellent. We only have like 4 minutes, so I'm like, anything to add, Emma, before I open up?
Just to, well, very short, I would repeat that, the legacy debt is a legacy of the crisis, and it will take time to reduce this legacy, and this is the same as with unemployment, which is the other big legacy that we have from the crisis, and the government and the society needs to be aware of the importance of reducing this, and as it has been said, democracies and tax and expenditure measures come from democracies.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Any questions from the floor? We have 2 minutes, so you have time for questions. We have time for questions. If not, we'll close it here. No questions? Okay, thank you very, very much. Yes, there's one there.
Thank you for the very stimulating reflections. I have a quick reflection and a question on the issue of national fiscal buffers. Two speakers emphasize the need of making further progress in the rebuild of national fiscal buffers. I fully agree with this idea. This is a necessity for countries like Spain and others in Europe. But at the same time, I think we have to be realistic and cautious about this idea. I mean, looking at the simulations put forward by José Luis and by Servas, it seems that even in reasonable and optimistic scenarios, it seems that it's going to take perhaps several decades to rebuild only in a small fraction of the buffer that we already exhausted during the last crisis. So this takes me to a very simple reflection. I think that we badly need a plan B in case that a recession hits again the European economy, especially taking into account that the margin of maneuver for monetary policy nowadays is significantly narrower than it was in 2008 or 2012. And my fear and my question to the three panelists is whether the proposals being discussed these days and been put forward by several commentators and institutions like the European Commission and also recently the IMF. Are these proposals sufficiently ambitious? Are they a proper plan B in case we face a recession in the next 3-4 years, or do we need to be more worried and be more ambitious and urgent with these issues? Thank you.
Okay, very good. Who'd like to take it? Yes.
Okay, let me
Sarah.
start off and then the others. First, I guess the question has to be more specified, and I apologize for that. Plan B for what? Plan B for a normal economic downturn, or a plan B for crisis type 2010-12? There's a major difference. I would say that if we talk about a normal economic downturn, cyclical downturns that we got in the past, I guess there's quite likely not to be much of a plan B available apart plan B at the national level. So at the national level, and that is where I come from, with the fiscal buffers, Spain, like all other countries, will be faced with a normal downturn over the medium term. And so at present, Spain is not ready to cope with even a normal downturn. Apart if the deficit will go up quite a lot, the debt will increase, and all that in an environment where we are uncertain about what will be the effects of the ending of the monetary stimulus that we have seen so far and how gradual that will be. There are major concerns of the medium term there. So a normal economic downturn, Spain should really be in a position to cater for that. When we talk about the crisis that we have seen in 2010, 2012, that's a completely different element. And so therefore, what the Commission is being proposing, and others as well, is a plan B for this kind of protracted economic downturns. It's the first proposal in December. We will come up with another proposal in end of May. You have to see this as kind of an evolutionary process. What we put on paper are ideas, first elements now in May which are more concrete, but it's only a kind of an embryo, if I allow it to say so. It has to build up over time. Some simulations and also recent work by the fund indicate that in order to have this kind of fiscal capacity at the central level, you need around the fund of around at least 2% of GDP to have some ammunition in case of a major downturn. Then the question is, how do you build that up? So if you build that up through national contributions, on top of what you have to do at the national level, it has to be very gradual. So it's only over 10 years or so that you can get there. So the idea and the question mark will be, and the interesting issue will be for June, what will the heads of state decide in the area of central fiscal capacity? Would they agree with the philosophy and setup? And would they launch a process that issue could be further developed over the medium term? If that is the case, then I would say plan B would be in preparation ongoing, but then we will have to see how quickly we get there.
From the Spanish perspective, I would not count on anything coming from Europe in the future in terms of a buffer. It's doubtful. If something is done, it would be not sizable enough, in my view. So I would focus on what we have to do here in terms of structural reforms on the fiscal and on the other areas. And to me here, the key thing, it will take time, no doubt. It will be a long-term process of reducing debt further and further to something that, in my view, should go well below 60. But of course, then the horizon will be even longer. But the key thing is a cultural change, in which you really are able to integrate in your way of doing things on the fiscal front a medium and long-term perspective. I'm moving away from this short-term mission here and there, where there is really no plan and no commitment should be for longer periods. And if the commitments are done for longer periods, this might be more compatible with more gradual paths and more anti-cyclical policies. And basically what I try to say here is, with all these fronts, what you should do things, undertake reforms, is that if you are able to move in this direction, I think we could be optimistic that this is achievable. But the challenge is substantial, I would say.
Anything to add?
Very short. I think the kind of mechanism that it has been proposed this is not about Spain. This is to strengthen the architecture that we have in the euro area, and this is needed for the euro area. In fact, in the case of Spain, possibly we would not benefit from this mechanism in a near future, because now, depending on how you design this mechanism, it would be very feasible that we will not benefit from it. But I have to say that in any case, this has also been mentioned by Servas, and the proposals that the Commission has, is thinking, and the IMF is thinking, and other countries too, is that the first line of defense should remain the national fiscal policy. So this is only meant for severe shocks when national fiscal policies could be overburdened. And so in a way, this is needed for the euro area, for having a solid architecture, but not for solving today's legacies.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. It's been an excellent discussion. Thank you all.